move on to another section, and I'm going to skip over our section on shaping responses because I think we covered that. But I want to look at the issues of medical device science versus regulatory science. There is maybe a little confusion about whether those are the same thing or different things. And Billy, you're right in that hot seat, and I hate to drop it right on you again first. But could you explain what your attitude is about those two things? Are they the same or different, or how might they be interpreted?
I think regulatory science, and I think the term you used was medical device science, are related. I mean, they're not exactly the same thing. Regulatory science is the study of science and processes that impact all products in reaching the market. In our case, obviously, it's FDA, but it can apply to drugs or devices or biologics or what have you. But I think there is a real infancy among the field of regulatory science for devices. We're not nearly as well developed as the pharmaceutical industry is with that in that regard, and I think that's one area that we'd really like to foster the development of, and I think that will take a collaboration between industry and FDA to make that happen. Examples are developing pre-market bench tests that can predict clinical performance so that we don't have to do long or clinical trials in hundreds of patients. We'd be delighted if we could do a bench test that accurately predicts the performance of the device and identifies the problems with the device before it reaches the market. That's better for everyone. So I do think we need to work harder on that. And related to that is really the undeveloped research infrastructure within the U.S. for conducting quality medical device trials. I know, new medical device companies have a very hard time getting off the ground and conducting a good clinical trial in the United States. And so we're interested in trying to develop ways that we can promote or foster that sort of thing. And we've had a couple ideas. One is to try to leverage data from outside the United States where there's a lot of device experience. Our problem with that data historically has been the quality of the data, not the quality of the device, not the quality of the people putting in the device, but the quality of the information we receive about that interaction. And so efforts to improve or set some standards for exactly what it is we would require for data from outside the United States that could be leveraged in a regulatory application, I think we'd be interested in talking about or engaging industry about potentially. The other is, just as I alluded to, the research infrastructure within the U.S. It really takes a collaborative approach of engineers and scientists and regulatory experts and physicians and clinical trialists to really iterate a device quickly and to bring it to the bedside and use it on patients and get back into the lab and fix it and bring it back and really have that productive, interactive cycle. And there's a few areas in our country that are set up for that, but probably not as many as we would like to see. And I think we view that as a barrier to speedy product development in this country.
Ralph?
A couple of thoughts, and I will start by saying I may be an outlier in two things that I say. I think the term regulatory science is a misnomer. I think it's a term that's just confusing because it is not science. At the end of the day, the decision to approve a product is not a science decision. It's a policy decision. Science is a key input, but you're balancing risks and benefits. And even defining benefits is not a scientific question. And I'll use a simple example out of the drug world. Rogaine. How many people have died from going bald? Nobody. Right? Does Rogaine have a very low but real side effects? Yes. That's a policy decision. It's not a science decision. Science is a critical impact. It's a critical factor. But we have to understand, I believe, that we are making a balancing between risk and benefit. And that's what the clearance or the approval policy or decision actually is. And we start talking about just science, 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 we lose track of the patient, patient needs, and patient autonomy. I think the decision or any regulatory approval process decreases patient autonomy because I then have fewer decisions I can make, fewer options I have for access. The second thing to think about is whether or not we can kind of co-opt pharma concepts and approaches into the device world. And I think we cannot. I think there are lessons we can learn, obviously, from anything. But I think that, the double-blind, placebo-controlled style model of pharma doesn't work in the vast majority of cases in the device world. And so I'm always leery of trying to take pharma concepts and apply them unthinkingly into the device world.
So I'm going to take issue with one thing you said,
Only one?
Ralph. Just one. I disagree with you. I don't think that decisions are policy decisions regarding individual products. I'd like to think that we make data-driven decisions. I think the word I might substitute for your word policy is judgment, in that they're based on data. Policy, to me, by using that word, seems to imply that there's some greater force at work here that is trying to prevent or get certain products to market based on something other than the scientific data, and I don't agree with that.
When it comes to studying the process itself, Bill, you've indicated that there are some weaknesses in surveys and some weaknesses in some of the work that's been done on recall issues. Josh, you noted the limitations of your study. So when it comes to actually looking at the processes itself, whether it's a science or not, what kinds of studies should we be doing, and who should be doing those kinds of studies? You, Josh.
Oh, me?
You're on.
I was hoping someone else would take that one. Well, it's a very good question. I think that one needs to collect data from as many sources as possible. Some of this data is very difficult to harvest. And so I think that, what we tried to do is dive deep, very deep, into what the real costs are of this process and try to understand and correlate time to money. And that's really, and when it comes to the investment and survival, that is real. For small companies, time is survival because it directly relates to the funds that they have available to keep everybody employed, all the jobs that are created by these companies, to get to the finish line. So to have an expedient process is extremely important.
Ralph, you're scribbling way too many notes not to have something to say.
Go ahead.
I think it's a critical question. I don't think that we have good methodologies to assess regulatory policy. I think that's you can lay this at the foot perhaps at the academics where I spend most of my time. We have not developed that. And we don't have good methodologies, in my opinion. We don't have consistent methodologies. The other challenge we have is a lot of people say a lot of things in very reputable places, and they may not be qualified to say it. And one of my pet peeves is reading major medical journals where people are commenting on regulatory affairs, usually physicians, and whether I agree or disagree with their policy, the number of times they simply get the law wrong is astonishing. And so I think that one of the broad lessons I've taken from this whole exercise is we need to develop methodologies, processes, and systems for regulatory process assessment. I think it's a major gap we have.
Bill, is there agency thinking on who should be conducting these studies?
Well, for me, the most basic question is, what are the questions we're trying to answer? Studies of what? What are we specifically asking, and what do we need to know that we don't know? And I mean, we could develop a laundry list of questions in about 5 minutes, but and then the question becomes, what data is there that we have that can answer those questions? And if we don't have it, how can we get it? And that's a little bit of, I think, what happened in the different presentations that you saw today. There were people thinking about, we want to evaluate the 510K program and process, and what data is available, or what can we get that will reasonably assess it. And I think you saw the shortcomings of that data as well. We are going to be implementing a quality assurance program, and in many respects it's pretty amazing. I like to use the analogy of a company making a medical device. I mean, I can't imagine a company making a medical device not having quality assurance programs in places and monitoring their performance, and how long does it take to build their widget, and purchasing controls and all the things we require of industry, we haven't done a great job of monitoring ourselves. And so we need to be monitoring the performance of the applications that come in. It shouldn't depend on which reviewer's desk an application ends up on. We should be consistent. We should have certain regulatory standards that are written in the regulations, and we should be applying them and measuring them and making sure we're following them. And that is part of one of the roles that the Center Science Council will be serving, is to better monitor and the performance of our programs, and much of that information will be making transparent and public as well.
Yeah, in the interviews that
I actually have one comment, if I may add one comment. I think it will be critical now that a lot of recommendations have been made, partly by FDA, partly possibly or likely by the IOM, to facilitate or develop mechanisms and methods that would allow the prioritization of those changes and look at the impact, look at cost and benefit. And more generally, I think it will be a key question to define success measure for the 510K process, which captures not only patient safety and effectiveness of the device, but more broadly also captures aspects of the ecosystem, like Josh study has revealed. I mean, there are so many factors that should be considered before changes are made, and so developing a solid understanding or even tool or methodology that would allow to maybe simulate some of the changes would be very helpful.
You're right on top of what I was going to ask you, because you've spoken with so many people, and there are so many factors in the medical device product development ecosystem that others in other industries or even life sciences sectors sometimes don't seem to have a full grasp of. Were there any that were particularly challenging that were revealed in your interviews that you thought this is an issue that we really need to pay attention to? And one that comes to my mind, I know you mentioned it, is the issue of companies feeling that they needed to have their responses be anonymous, which obviously puts some constraints on the kinds of studies that you can do.
That definitely was one. I think more generally, one of the challenges for any survey work is active participation by the community. And so we hope that everyone who works with the process is concerned enough to further improve the process and contribute to discussion that they will participate. But if there are some kind of mechanisms or panels of data that would be on a regular basis actually be collected from the process stakeholders to also gauge the potential improvement of the process over time, we think that would be useful.
The other, I guess the other comment I would make, we've certainly spent a lot of time talking about what FDA can do better, but there are things that industry can do better as well. And when we look at things like quality of the application that we receive, as you might imagine, they're not all perfect and they're not all good. So certainly some of the back and forth that occurs during a 510K process or a PMA process can be because the manufacturer didn't submit data that they probably should have submitted. And so certainly I think that's an area that we, I don't know that I have, it is one of those, what is the question and what is the answer? Well, the question is, we know the question, what is the quality of the applications we receive? And I think that's one of the areas where we'll be interested in looking. At CEDAR, the applications need to meet a certain bar before they'll even consider them. We've never done that because we recognize the importance of interacting with the medical device companies and helping foster them along. But that is certainly something that shows up in the data.